What's up, guys? Welcome to the podcast where we can listen to trans and gender non-binary voices telling us their story in their voice, reminding us that each of us is not alone. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Not Alone. We have with us the radiant Gabrielle Claiborne, and Gabrielle's been with us earlier before, and she has started sharing her journey about how she went from being super successful before to being super successful now. She is evidence that that it can be done, and I want to hear more about that story. But before we get started, Gabrielle, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself before we get in?
Sure, Darshan. It's great to be back with you here today as we continue this vulnerable and courageous conversation. My name is Gabrielle Claiborne. I use she, her pronouns. I am the co-founder and CEO of Transformation Journeys Worldwide. We are an inclusion training and consulting firm with a trans and gender expansive focus. So we help a myriad of organizations, including corporate America, healthcare providers, nonprofit, educational institutions, even spiritual communities on their journey of transforming their environments to be fully inclusive of trans and non-binary folks. So that's what I do on my day job. There's many other organizations, LGBTQ advocacy organizations that I sit on boards and volunteer for. So I'm just, I'm living my passion all over again as my most authentic self.
But that journey to being your authentic self, and we discussed this in the last interview, had a lot of difficult processes. And I think we just started talking and we sort of barely begun covering this idea of you starting to tell people about who you actually are. What would be wonderful to kind of recap a little bit is you kind of getting into adulthood and what that looked like, and who you identified as then. And could we talk a little bit about that time? Say around your 20s or so.
Yeah.
And we'll kind of go from there.
So I was a straight cisgender male and had life by the tail. I was married to a beautiful woman. We had 3 amazing kids. Had a very successful career in the construction industry. As you may know, that's a very male-dominated industry. My dad was in that, so I inherited that vocational career from him, just being, in that space. I had a great college career, a great college experience with Emory University and then Georgia Tech. So, everything was going beautifully in my life as it appeared on the outside until, you started looking through the cracks and thinking, okay, what is really going on with this person, right? And that was when, all these different life invitations started showing up in my life that I ultimately had to get honest with. And it was this hate that was playing in the background that was related to how I knew myself to be, which was different from the sex that I was assigned at birth. And back then, this was pre-internet days. The language didn't even exist then. So not only did I find it difficult to understand what was going on in me, I could definitely not share this with anybody else, because how would I even approach the conversation, right? So growing up in the conservative environment that I grew up in, I basically suppressed and pushed and buried all of these realities in my life down and just overcompensated them in how I showed up in the world. And that was how my 20s kind of played out, right?
So did you have all 3 kids in your 20s?
24, 26. Yes. By the time I was 29, we had 3 kids.
Wow. And you had a beautiful wife who saw you in a different role.
Oh, yeah.
And you were still struggling. Were there any so one of the things I've always thought of is home is your refuge. Home is where you get to be who you are. You don't have any pretenses. Did you have pretenses at home?
Well, of course. I mean, I couldn't be me, right? I mean, I had to mask everything that was going on under the surface. And again, how I did that is I overcompensated by being a husband, a father, a successful business person, a very engaged and involved person in my spiritual community, even in my family. I mean, I can remember having conversations with cousins about, oh my God, this person is the ideal model of what success looks like in our family. And if I could only just grab them and say, oh, you don't really know the half of it, but yeah, it was just navigating all that then. And, being able to, it's one thing to live your life in congruent from a perspective of congruency. It's another thing to live your life when you know something is not right, yet you continue to show up inauthentically and try to make sense of life. You try to find successes wherever you can find. And a lot of times there are short-lived successes. There are those moments where you feel like, okay, I've got a breakthrough. But ultimately that tape in the background keeps coming forward. It keeps, making itself known. It just doesn't go away until you finally get honest with it,
Which really takes me to this moment where you start thinking about, this is sort of little frou-frou, if you will, or I'm not one for emotions, and I struggle with them myself. So it's one of those things I have to ask.
I have no problem with them.
Good for you. Lucky you. No, but I guess my question is, did those successes, as you were winning them, not feel as vibrant because they were not the successes you wanted? Or were they just like part of any human being where once you achieve something, you've moved past it?
They were vibrant, but they were short-lived.
Okay.
That was the reality of all these successes that I was experiencing. I mean, I started a business, I was making money, our family was growing, our kids were like showing up in different ways, and they were becoming, more visible and more prominent and more successful. Yet, despite all of that, I kept grappling with, what about me?
Right.
What about me? I feel like I'm giving my life up for everything and everyone around me. But
Right.
I'm the one who is missing out on experiencing what life should be.
Right. And your wife.
And I don't say that, Darshan, from a egotistical or a
Oh,
boastful
no.
space, right?
Yeah.
I just needed to experience some peace, some
Yeah.
alignment, some wholeness in my own life that wasn't there.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. The reason I was going to ask another question before I got back to the issue you just raised. My first question is, did your wife suspect any of this?
Nothing. Not one thing. When I eventually came out to her,
Yeah.
she was completely blindsided by this.
Okay.
My kids didn't know. I mean, my parents, nobody knew. I mean, I was playing the lie so well. I mean, I was fooling everybody but me.
Which takes me to just societal sort of perspective, right? And the societal perspective, they always talk about the Asian cultures versus Western cultures. And usually Asian cultures are seen as very community-based culture, if you will. And that's for better or for worse. And then Western cultures are individual-based, if you will, for better or for worse. What I hear you describing is you manage to, from a community perspective, to make everyone's life better. And you manage to sort of address all their needs. But from an individual's perspective, you had to go back to yourself every night and go, what about me?
Yeah.
Do you feel like you paid a price there, or do you feel like that was the price to be who you are today?
I felt like it was my responsibility. I felt like it culturally, it was my role as the husband, as the father in that family unit, as the successful son.
Yeah.
I felt like there was a responsibility on me that governed how I showed up. Okay. But what I didn't understand then was I I couldn't even be the best me then because I was hiding from me.
Right.
I was hiding from the real me, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's something that I had to learn over the course of the last 12 years of getting honest and with myself, and leaning into this space of authenticity. So, yeah, and here's the thing: it's not that I regretted the responsibility. I felt like I could shoulder it, but oh my goodness, I could have shown up so much better, Darshawn. And I think if anybody walks away with anything from this,
Yeah.
it's that. And if you want to be the best version of yourself, you have to deal with you first. You got to make sure you're showing up authentically first, because either you will implode or people will see through that and they'll read through that and they won't trust you. And so that's what I've learned.
So we've talked a little bit about the preview, if you will. The 20s were a little I mean, you showed up amazingly. Your 30s cracks started showing, I guess. And your 40s is when you sort of came out. Could you talk a little bit about that moment, the moment you decided that you have to talk about who you actually are? The how you started with that conversation. Who did you have it with first?
Well, first of all, it wasn't one thing that made me get honest with myself. It
Okay.
was a series of life's invitations. It was a series of failures. It was a series of disappointments. It was a series of setbacks, right? So there wasn't just one thing that said, okay, this was the turning point in my life. I just got to a place in my life, Darshawn, where I had enough, and I was like, okay, then what how do I deal with this? How do I process this? How do I take an authentic step? How do I stop, get honest with myself, and take an authentic step, right? It was during my mid 40s when I had just started a second business and had been very successful in this business. Did a lot of large construction development across the Southeast, even on the West Coast. And there were opportunities for me to hibernate in the basement because I worked out of our home.
Yeah.
And during those moments of hibernation, this is when the internet came on the scene, and I was doing some internet surfing, and I stumbled across a website that I saw myself in. This website. It was a picture of trans women. And immediately I slammed my computer shut because it scared me to death. It's like, oh, this exists. I didn't even know this existed. Okay. I was raised in this bubble, this conservative bubble, which I had no concept of trans people.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I finally got courageous enough and opened my computer back up, I leaned in a little bit more. And then that started my journey of learning who I am, finally having the context, finally having the images, finally starting to learn the language that existed that helped me connect with something that I was missing for 3 decades of my life, right? And it was over that time that I met who I call my first midwife. This person had a dressing service here in Atlanta, and she would actually dress biological men as women, cross dressers, right? And so I made an appointment with her. That's where I met myself the first time, fully aligned as Gabrielle. And after that moment, seeing myself in the mirror for the first time, realizing that's me, then this journey got steeper by the minute. I knew I needed to really lean in, and that's how things got started.
Which I think is interesting, right? I feel like the journey, the conversations I've had suggested the journey to being trans is sort of those baby steps along the way. And the first step is cross-dressing. And usually that conversation starts with pictures, or that starts in your childhood when your mom dresses you in something, or you're playing with your cousins or your sister and you'd wear her clothes. You missed all of that. You sort of jumped to your 30s and you had a genetic woman dress you and have you introduce yourself to yourself.
Yes.
Did you, at that time, so this is your 30s, you've got several more years before.
Well, this is in my 40s.
Oh, this is already in your 40s. Okay. I thought you saw the first image in your 30s. Did I misunderstand somewhere?
45, and I didn't see my midwife until 49.
Oh, okay. So you had 4 years between that first image and 49, where you were like, I need to be who I am. Conversations suggest that those 4 years is often stretched for many other people into decades sometimes. But there are different thoughts that go through your head. Things like, how do I make this work with my current life? What
will I lose?
What will I lose?
Will I be alone for the rest of my life? I could go on and on and on. All of these are the questions that trans people have to face, especially if they live their life so long inauthentically. What I now know is that, and this is what people don't think about when they have the conversation around authenticity. They don't think when they're not authentic that they're not damaging themselves. But what happens is, with every inauthentic step you take, you get further and further from setting yourself up for success in your relationships, in your career, wherever and however you show up. With every inauthentic step you take, it's like getting in debt. You can get in debt like this, but getting out of debt takes so much longer, so much more effort. And when you live a life for so long, Darshan, you have to spend time, if you're willing to reconcile all those areas of your life.
So at some point you had to come out?
I did.
Wait, that moment when you had to come out, and I recognize it wasn't a single moment, it was multiple moments. Yeah. But there was that first person you had to tell. When you were going to tell that first person, had you reached the point of, I don't care where it goes, I have to tell you? Or was it a conversation of hope where you go, I hope you'll still be there at the end of this conversation? And who was it with?
It was the latter. It was a conversation that, it was a conversation that I felt like I needed to have because I was so miserable. Okay. It's one thing to not know who you are and not have the language. It's another thing to know who you are and have the language and be inauthentic with that information. Right. Yeah. So, I felt the weight of being dishonest, because when you know better, you do better. And I was trying to do better. And so there was this weight of, I've got to be honest. But at the end of the day, I was hoping that with my being honest, is that going to set myself up for the change in the form of this relationship? And it was my youngest daughter who I came out to first. Yeah, I'll never forget that moment. We were on a road trip. She was actually a voice contestant, and we went to Memphis, Tennessee for her to audition. And on the way back, there were signs that she started recognizing in me that I was starting to slowly transition with things like I would wear stick-on nails. I would grow my hair out. I'm losing weight, right? So these kind of signals were like, what's going on with you? And
How old
so
was she?
that was that first conversation, and I can tell you that was one of the scariest things that I had to do. And we both cried once, we got everything out on the table, and she was so gracious and said, I don't care who or what you are, you will always be my parent and I will always love you. And that right there gave me courage to take the next step with the next person,
First of all, that's amazing. How old was she when you told her?
She was early 20s.
Okay. The reason I'm asking the question is, does one of the things, I mean, the interviews I've done mostly suggest that the younger generation is far more open to these conversations than earlier generations. And was it useful to start with her? Was she the most accepting place to start, or was that just luck of the draw? And how did that affect the next person you told?
I don't think it was the luck of the draw, because my youngest daughter, you have to understand, to your point about younger generations being more inclusive and open to have these courageous conversations. I believe, because I have 3 kids, and not all 3 kids are where my youngest kid is with me. Okay. And I think that how people are raised, how they're domesticated, what they're exposed to, determines how they show up in their later years, right? And my youngest daughter had gay friends in school. My oldest 2, they didn't have that, right? So they didn't have the context that my youngest daughter had as it relates to the width, breadth, and depth of humanity, right?
Right.
And so that was a benefit for me. And I think, subconsciously down deep, I knew that if I had a chance with anybody, it would be her over anybody, right?
Right.
So that's one of the reasons that I think that conversation took place. I think the universe was conspiring on both of our behalfs when it happened. And yes, it did. And it does help us people. When you take a courageous step without knowing your exact destination and the results are favorable, what that does, it grows courage within your heart. You actually flame the whispers of your heart, and you grow courageous, and you say, okay, I remember how that happened in that situation. So I'm hoping that as I continue to be authentic, that the results are going to be similar with the next person, right? That is always the hope, but there's no guarantee, Darshan.
Right. There was an interesting thing you said, though. You said that she pointed out that you had stick-on nails. So, I think you mentioned the hair was the other thing, which I think is interesting, because that means that you were, for lack of a better term, your egg had cracked. You were presenting even to this extent you could control, but you had to present in some way. And I'm surprised that with stick-on nails or with the hair, your wife didn't notice at that point, or did she?
Well, because I was a lot more cautious around my wife.
Ah.
Okay. And the whole stick-on nails, the losing weight, the growing my hair out, that was all about connecting with things that would allow me to feel like me being authentic.
Yeah.
There's things that we do to connect with so that we can say, yeah, this is me. This is how I value showing up in the world, right? So it was the stick-on nails. It was those kind of things. And, around my daughter, I was less concerned with that. I mean, I was still cautious, but a little less concerned,
I can imagine, again, I spent a large portion of my life in India, and then I spent a large portion of my life in Philadelphia, which is a lot more liberal than, say, India. How did, politically, how did that play itself out for you? To come out, like, did people go, Gabrielle is being influenced by CNN or by the liberal media or whatever it is? Like, what was that reaction politically like? And again, I'm not dissing any political affiliation. Go for your own affiliations, but I'm just asking, how did that play itself out sociologically for you?
Well, again, I'm going to substantiate something that I've already said earlier, and that is I was domesticated in a way and in an environment the way my parents were domesticated. Right. So I was raised in a very conservative space, both religious and politically affiliated.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what I didn't know. All I knew was my lane based on how I was raised. So I adopted that, right? And this is what happens with so many people. They adopt on how they were raised and how they show up, and it determines how they show up. So, when I came out, I mean, my goodness, I mean, media then isn't what media is now, right? I think if one thing has changed over the last 10 years, more than anything, is how we communicate, the accessibility to information, people, owning their perspectives and their opinions, and, and to the point of saying anything other than myself, I don't accept and I don't appreciate, right? So, and that's the challenge with our community, with our culture, right? But as I started leaning into who I was, I started recognizing that my beliefs, the things that I was raised to think were equitable and just, weren't. And so I immediately had to reevaluate, who actually represents me equitably, right? So my religious affiliation has changed, my political affiliation has changed as a result of this journey that I've been on. And I have to say that I feel like my aligned affiliations in those spaces now is more equitable than they were in the past. There are things that I didn't even know that I didn't even know back then. And quite honestly, today I'm ashamed to say that, right? But it was just the way I was raised, Darshan. And I feel like, we as human beings have the opportunity to open up our mind to things that are outside of our comfort zone, that are outside of our understanding, that are outside of our personal lived experience.
Yeah.
And if we're willing to do that, we might recognize that, oh my God, the way I think, the way I believe, the way I know this world to be is much bigger than that,
Yeah.
And so over the course of my journey, all of those affiliations have evolved along with me.
Which is such a wonderful story, right? The idea of self-discovery resulted in you discovering the world.
Yes.
But do you feel like this journey of self-discovery has given you multiple viewpoints into multiple viewpoints? And what I mean by that is, based on what you're saying, you're less conservative. I don't want to say you're not conservative, but you're less conservative. Some might classify that as liberal. You're female, even though you might previously have been seen as a husband, as male. What has been the difference in perspective? And let's start with the male versus female. You have a unique perspective to offer on that. Talk to me a little bit about that. How is life different from both sides?
Oh my God, where do I start? I mean, from being an entrepreneur, Darshan, being a male entrepreneur and being a female entrepreneur, completely different. I was like this male kick-ass, take names, get things done, right? I was all about, pushing through things and not necessarily creating collaborative engagement and collaborative environments and making sure that people were being heard and perspectives were being welcomed in and integrated into decisions, right?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. As a female entrepreneur, I am now doing that, and I am recognizing the value in doing that.
But are you expected to do that? Or is that just the values you've sort of self-created?
It's a part of me showing up authentically.
Okay.
I feel like you can't separate my gender from how I show up in all the different ways that I show up with a career, with a relationship, with, however I show up in my volunteer work. You can't separate that. And the other thing, Darshan, is in relationships. Oh my gosh. I have a boyfriend now. Okay. We've been dating for on and off for 3 years, and we've just carried the relationship to a new level.
Congratulations.
Now, thank you. And now, I remember what it was like to be the husband, the boyfriend, the man, right? I knew my role then. Now, not only have I had to learn a different role, and by the way, I haven't been reluctantly learning the new role. I've really embraced this, right? But now I'm having to deal with me in a relationship back then, right? A guy. And, navigating that, understanding how to honor him and give him space, yet ask for the things that I need as a woman in the relationship. And by the way, this is a straight cisgender man who has never been with a transgender woman.
Right.
So this thing is new for both of us, but learning how to do relationships as a female is completely different. And then the last thing is I didn't have any BFFs when I was a guy.
Right.
Well, I have a BFF now, and how to be a BFF to another BFF. Lord Jesus. All the things that I've had to learn in that process has just, it's really set me up for success in so many different ways. But yeah, showing up and living as a woman versus how I was showing up in the world, whoa, completely different experience.
And it sounds like you've been lucky in some ways, but in other ways you've paid a price. And
you have to be willing, Darshan, to say, you have to be all in, and you have to be willing to understand that there will be consequences along the way. But how you navigate those consequences, how you give people space, how you love them from a distance, how that you recognize this is just as much their journey as it is yours, really determines how you come out on the other end. If you come out on the other end,
We'll have Gabrielle back because and we will keep track of where we are in this conversation, which is I'm going to say this, Gabrielle, because I want to be clear about this. We're not going to short shrift. We're going to go back to having those discussions because I really tried to shortchange that, and it's just not fair because there are so many wonderful discussions there, discussions that we can all learn from. But before we go, Gabrielle, any last parting words for people, especially where can people find you?
Well, definitely, folks can find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter. You can find us on our website at www.transformationjourneys.com. I have a book called Embrace Your Truth, A Journey of Authenticity, which is on Amazon. I've got a TED Talk called Building Your Courage Muscles, and we talk a lot. I share a lot of the insights that we talk about here with you, Darshan. So yeah, there's a number of different ways that you can find me, and I really encourage folks to reach out to me and connect.
Awesome. Thank you again, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Darshan.